Hello everyone, thanks for having me today. It's a real honour to be able to speak to you all. My name's John Burn-Murdoch. I'm going to be talking for the next 40 minutes or so about the lessons that I've learned from visualising the COVID-19 pandemic over, well, I guess it's now about 12 months. So to set the scene, what I want to do is start off by talking about the perspective I'm coming from in this talk. So data visualisation is obviously an enormously broad church. There's all sorts of different uses for data viz in different settings. But what I'm talking about today specifically is data visualization for a mass audience. Now, as a visual journalist, I'm always dealing with a large audience to some extent. The Financial Times is behind a paywall, so it's perhaps not the largest audience of all. But what's really changed dramatically over the last year working on the pandemic is that that audience has become enormous. It's become truly global, and it was quite obvious from as early as the sort of first couple of weeks of March 2020 that my charts were suddenly being seen by an audience of millions across the world instead of just the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands who would typically see them on the Financial Times website. So the principles I'm going to be talking about today and the best practices are all geared towards communicating to a hugely diverse audience of people in terms of their familiarity with charts. I'm not saying that what I recommend today is going to be the case if you're producing a visual installation for an art gallery or a sort of coffee table style piece of work, but really just thinking about data visualization fundamentally as an act of communication, and particularly of mass communication. So to start with something that I suspect reads as incredibly obvious, but I think is actually relatively little discussed in the data viz world, I'm going to talk about the fact that to create really effective, really powerful charts, you really need to understand how people consume charts. Now, to sort of talk a little bit about why that's not as obvious as you might think, if you look online at the numbers of tutorials there are for making graphics, making data viz, whether it's in R, Python, D3, you name it, generally they're focused on the technical element of constructing a chart. What chart type to choose, how to get your geometries, your shape, space and color exactly right, how to do things more efficiently, optimizing interactivity, that kind of thing. There's relatively little on thinking about what more qualitative elements you can optimize to ensure that people understand, enjoy, and remember your charts. And, this is where I perhaps get almost a bit too sort of corporate or business focused in my view of this. But when you're making charts for a mass audience, it serves you well, I think, to think about them almost as if you're creating an advert. Like, there is decades of research from people who create billboard ads, for example, on what you should do in terms of messaging, in terms of how you use text, in terms of how you use color and all of that to elicit a specific response in your audience. And I think it's that communication way of thinking that is relatively underrepresented at the moment in best practice guidelines for charts. So as I say, when I've been creating charts that I'm hoping and latterly expecting are going to be seen by an audience of millions, I've really had to focus on, first of all, how do I ensure they're clear enough to reach and be easily understood by millions of people? And then how do I make sure that they stick in their memory and they're not just, post 79 out of 100 that ping on their Twitter feed every day. So, without any further ado, and I think quite fittingly, given that I'm talking about lessons I learned from the pandemic, it's time to look at the science. So I'm going to show you here some work that is not my own work, but it's probably the single most influential data viz research paper that I've ever come across, and it's one that I and our wider team at the FT use very frequently and constantly have in our mind when we're thinking about how to optimize our work for understanding by a mass audience. And that is this paper from a team led by Michelle Borkin in the US on what are the characteristics of visualization that lead people to recognize the story of that graphic and then to recall it later on. So the slide I'm going to show you in a second is looking at an eye tracking experiment from this paper and I'm going to show you a GIF, so it's going to loop. If you don't see it first time, that's fine, it'll come again. But what it is it's showing where people's eyes actually focus when they're given a chart for a relatively short period of time, 10 seconds, 30 seconds or so, and asked, what do you see here? What can you make out? What's the main takeaway? And so what you're going to see is a sort of simple illustration of a chart and then a blue dot on that chart showing where people look when they're presented with that chart. And what you see is that blue dot moves straight up to the title of the chart, has a little explore of the title, then comes down and reads off the axis label to see what units the chart is showing, and then reads across the chart content itself. I'll just let that play again. So the eyes go to the title, they then come down to see the vertical axis, and then they read across the contents of the chart. The key point here is that that initial focus goes straight to the title. And the researchers did additional follow-up analysis of the same group of participants and found that when people later on were asked to remember any information about a chart and just write a sort of free-form description of what they'd seen, words featured very prominently. The title, any annotations, labelling were all mentioned far more often when people remembered the chart than the actual visual content of the plot itself. And that is something we really sort of centre on in our work at the FT. Our view is very much that, you know, you can make a stunning chart, you can have all your geometry right, it can be technically executed perfectly, but if the messaging, if the text is absent in the worst case scenario, or too sterile, too dry, you're going to lose a hell of a lot of people. And the way I like to think about that is that your text can help your chart be understandable, enjoyable and memorable for someone who is quote unquote not a chart person. Those of us watching or participating in the conference today, I'm sure, consider ourselves chart people or data people to a greater or lesser extent. And that means when we see a chart, it's already a thing that we're familiar with and that we like and that we have a sort of way of understanding. Whereas there are millions and millions of people out there, a lot more non-chart people than chart people, as it were, who need that helping hand. So to give you an example from the pandemic of this sort of way of thinking in action, I'm going to talk through the origin story, as it were, of our coronavirus trajectory tracker. So probably the most high profile chart that we've put out over the last 12 months. And I'm going to start by showing how this was sparked, how this came about, by showing you an email I got from one of my colleagues on, I think this was March the 10th or 11th. And so she's one of our general news reporters who was covering the sort of nascent pandemic back then, or certainly the nascent epidemic as far as the UK and Europe was concerned. And she just asked me, she's wondering if I had any data on daily cases in Italy, which of course at the time was sort of the focus of all the world's attention. There were grim pictures coming out of there in the news reports of bodies in morgues and that kind of thing. And she's asking me, okay, do we have any data on daily cases for Italy, and can we compare that to the UK, perhaps other countries as well? She hadn't managed to find that data anywhere else. And so I rustled up that same afternoon or evening or whatever it was, a quick version, sort of version 0.0, as it were, of what became our high-profile trajectory trackers. So you can see, for those of you who remember the final version of this chart, or who've encountered the final version of this chart, the geometry, what is shown, what is plotted here, is essentially unchanged from the final version. We've got the number of days since a country first reached its 100th confirmed case going horizontally, and then you've got a log scale, a logarithmic y-axis of the total number, cumulative number of confirmed cases up to that point, and a set of countries shown on there coloured by things like their global region or other aspects that I'll come on to in a minute. But obviously, you know, if I published that, I doubt it would have cut through to a huge audience the way it ultimately did. There's nothing here really telling you what's going on. There's a lot of assumed knowledge. Obviously, I sent that to my colleague in the context of this email chain. We both knew what we were talking about and looking at. But if I just put this, if we published this on the FT, on social media, you know, a few people, again, chart people or COVID data people would have thought, oh, right, interesting. But it wouldn't have had any sort of mass resonance. So here's the next version of this when it's been styled as we style all our charts on the Financial Times. So we've got that trademark sort of salmon pink background. I'm now using the colours from our main colour palette. Again, doing some sort of semantic use of colour there. So I'm highlighting some Asian countries in this sort of light blue. I've got South Korea in a different blue because it wasn't clear what trajectory it was on by that point, and a few other colours dotted around. There's a bit more text on the chart now. We've got both axes labelled. I've got that source and footnote at the bottom as well. But again, sure, this, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of design, this is now neater. This is a better fit for what we would publish on the FT, but it's still missing those crucial ingredients. So here's the final version that was published. I think this was on March the 12th. So still about 2 weeks before the UK, for example, actually went into lockdown. And now we've got all of that additional labelling added. Again, going back to that research, these are the key bits of information that are going to be the first thing that someone encountering this chart focuses on. And they're going to set the scene for everything else that they take away from it. So we've got a title, a very active title, descriptive narrative title, that most Western countries were on the same coronavirus trajectories. Hong Kong and Singapore, by contrast, have managed to slow the spread. So straight away, you've got a message which grabs you, which brings you in, and which tells you something that is happening in the world. The fact that there's a chart here as well is almost incidental. I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating there, but the point is, whether or not you are someone who builds and works with data viz multiple times a day, or someone who last really spent any time with charts when you're age 16 and doing some compulsory maths or science education, whichever of those groups you fall into, the words here tell you what's going on. And so if you are someone who doesn't consider themselves a chart person, you've got your entry point. You can now understand the geometry of the chart. You can work out what's going on with the lines, with the shape, with the space, with the colour, because you know what message it's trying to tell. If the chart simply said cumulative number of cases by number of days since 100th case as the title, that's a hell of a lot more technical, there's a lot more jargon, and it's going to be much less accessible to people who are not familiar with charts. The other thing we've obviously got here is these annotations towards the right hand side, actually explaining some of the stuff you can see on the chart. So this is more geared towards someone who has not been following the pandemic and COVID data in a huge amount of detail. They immediately have the queries that they would have had of this chart answered. So they can see, oh right, so Japan, its line is further down, the virus is spreading less fast there and less widely, but we can see that it's not quite clear yet whether the spread has actually slowed in Japan or they're not doing enough testing. Korea, we can see, which was of course the big focus here as we were looking for how countries could get off that steep curve and flatten. We've got an explanation there about how it has slowed its spread from the initial pace. And you can also look at Singapore and Hong Kong and see what they had done right. So that text, when we looked at what people were talking about around the context of this graphic on social media and on the Financial Times website, that text was the key part that really seemed to cut through and cause people to keep coming back to this chart and indeed to share this chart with other people. So the first lesson of the pandemic for me, I think, was that using text and other annotation is really critical for making sure a chart goes from being a chart for data viz people, shall we say, to a chart that is truly accessible to a really mass audience of people who they're not involved in charts and data every day. But suddenly this is the sort of democratization of charts by using text to make them more accessible. The next lesson, and this is for me one of the most fundamental lessons anyone can learn in the process of building data viz, is that there's a big difference between making the smartest version of a chart you possibly can and the clearest version of a chart you possibly can. As with everything, there are obviously exceptions where you can do both of these things. But during the pandemic, I think there have been several examples of how these really are in tension with one another a lot of the time. So sometimes, and this was more the case, I think, in the earlier part of my career, but it's still a recurring theme, and I think this is something that a lot of people here today will recognise as well. Sometimes we can get into the habit of thinking that effective data visualisation is about optimising for precision and objectivity. There's a sort of list of technical tasks, and if you nail every one of them, you'll make the perfect chart. You're using maths and geometry to arrive at the best solution. It's a very sort of technical, structured process. But then I actually publish a chart and it suddenly becomes very clear that that is simply not the case. That is a convenient but very rarely true description of what we should be aiming for when we make a data visualization. So I'm going to come back to this same chart and talk through all of the clever technical things that I thought I was doing with this chart when I made it, and then how the chart then, when the chart encountered reality, shall we say, a lot of my assumptions were turned on their head. So the first difference, and I'm just going to flick back between these two charts. This is the one that I've shown you already. This was the data plotted on a logarithmic y-axis. The point of this was to say, well, we know that the pandemic, especially in the early stage, spreads exponentially. So the shape of the curves on this chart, if we plotted it on a linear axis, on a linear scale, they would all be arcing upwards from gentle slopes to steep slopes. And to me, you're using a lot of visual bandwidth there just to show something that we assume is the default, that all of these curves are going to be getting steeper and steeper in these early weeks. So by going for a log scale, you sort of free up more bandwidth, as it were, in the reader's head, and you allow them to focus on what matters, which is you can now do the key thing that readers at this stage wanted to do, which is compare the trajectories of different countries on a straight line. You can look at this and say, okay, the virus seems to be spreading more quickly in Spain than in France, and France in turn more quickly than the UK. You can also, because it's a straight line, you can forecast out ahead and work out where the rate of cases in your country is going to be a few days or a week further down the line. You can answer that critical question that we set out to answer here if we refer back to my colleague's email, which is how are countries doing compared to Italy? You can answer that much more easily with these straight lines that are easy to extrapolate than with the curves where it's harder to work out exactly where a line will be at a certain point in time. So my thinking here was all framed around this idea that when someone's looking at this chart, the whole sort of framework they're operating in that determines what their takeaway message is about, are these two countries or three countries on the same course? Or how many days until the country I'm interested in is at a certain level of cases that I know sort of means something? And therefore that they're not thinking, well, how many pixels represent 100 cases? They're not worried about what's going on the y-axis. They're looking for more of a sort of overarching message. However, let's have a look at some of the feedback that started pouring into that. And I'll say, just as a quick aside here, for anyone who isn't in the habit of publishing their work on social media, now I know it's not for everyone, and there are certainly some suboptimal features of Twitter, shall we say, but it's an incredible way to work out what does and doesn't work in a chart, and to gauge the sort of reaction, again, of both chart people and non-chart people very quickly. So I was inundated with messages around responding to these charts for week after week after week, and continue to be this year. But this was a snapshot of some of the initial feedback to that chart. Now, obviously, loads of people understood the log axis fine, but you know, any critical feedback is always worth paying attention to. And the fact that the majority of people got it doesn't negate the fact that plenty of people didn't. So lots of people here very confused by what's going on in the y-axis. Some of them perhaps know what a log scale is, but just thought it wasn't clearly explained. Others clearly are just baffled, and that's not a reaction you want with your chart. However, my response to that was not to just think, oh right, okay, like back to the drawing board, start again. It's got to be linear. People aren't getting this. My response was to think, okay, I'm in an advantageous position here that I'm on Twitter where I'm presenting these charts, and this is a space where I can continue these conversations. So what I did was I immediately posted a long explanation, or not too long, but a relatively thorough explanation of exactly why logarithmic y-axes were well suited to visualizing data that grows exponentially. That got a very good response, and we followed up on that at the FT by actually making a whole video explainer which talked about all of the decisions we were making when we made these charts and how to understand them. And this seemed to work really, really well in terms of softening some of that initial confusion that some people had to the chart. And my favourite thing about this is that what you get when you do this kind of work, what you'll see when you explain things clearly and have them in the public domain, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, whatever, is your audience will start helping you explain this stuff to other people. So what we started to see quite soon was these other people jumping into the replies to me, explaining to the people who've been confused, look, this is a log scale, this is what they do, don't worry about it, and actually pointing people to the video where I'd explained this. So instead of thinking, well, I've just published the chart, I'm done, I'm going to walk away, by sort of staying in that conversation around the chart, I was able to ensure that as few people as possible actually remained confused, and to really try and improve understanding of log scales, full stop. And just as a quick aside, something I find quite amusing when I look back at these messages is that you'll see on the left-hand side there, two of the people who'd been confused by the log scale, well, one of them, their account is now suspended, and the other one, their account no longer exists. So I like to think of that as being a little example that people who don't understand log scales have other failings in life, shall we say, that lead them to be kicked off of Twitter. Anyway, back to the important stuff. All of this about log scales and people perhaps initially not understanding them but gradually getting their heads around them brings me on to what, in a huge sea of contenders, is actually my favourite chart of the pandemic, and that is this. What you're looking at here is data from Google Trends, which for the unfamiliar is measuring how much search interest on Google there is for topics over time. And what we see here is this is the numbers of people worldwide searching for log scale on Google. And I've got that going back for the last 5 years or so. So from late 2015 through to so from late 2015 through to mid 2020. And what you see there is a big spike. Searches for log scale in that 5 year period reached their peak on around the 22nd of March 2020. And coincidentally, that was about a week after we started publishing these log scale charts on the FT. And the interest, the numbers of people looking at those charts had really ramped up over that week. So I don't think it's unreasonable for me and for us at the FT to think that the proliferation of log scale charts and our use of explainers around them really did help actually educate a hell of a lot of people on what log scales are. And I know that from other anecdotal evidence as well. I had sort of school friends who I'd not spoken to for 15 years getting in touch saying they were explaining my charts to their mum and that kind of thing. So it was a real demonstration that by sticking around and actually explaining what your chart is showing to people, you can really help people become more visually literate. So the lesson there, is that if there is confusion around a chart that you've made, that's on you. It's no good just saying, oh, how do these people not understand log scales? You've got to do the work to make sure that your audience is not left confused. And the key point here for me as well is doing this additional explanation in situ, doing this explanation where the chart appeared. It's not much use publishing a chart over here and then a few days later explaining how it was meant to work over here. You've got to try and do that where your audience is so that they are not going to get lost along the way and walk away scratching their head. But there's more. The reactions to these log scales were not purely about the log scales or about the geometry, about the space, about the numbers. When you look at some of these other responses, a lot of them were much more qualitative, or they were quite personal. In some cases, they were even political. So I'm sure I don't need to explain to everyone that the pandemic, COVID, has all become quite politicised, quite partisan over the last year. There are camps of pro-maskers and anti-maskers, pro-lockdown, anti-lockdown, all of this stuff. And it turns out that the use of log scales in charts is actually another example of this. So we had some people saying that they felt like the use of a log scale was sort of dampening the impact of increased numbers of cases. So a line went up and up and up. It then started to gradually flatten as the rate of increase slowed, even if the numbers were still going up. So people felt like we were diminishing, we were downplaying the impact of increased spread as time went on because those lines were becoming flatter, whereas if they were linear, they'd have been going straight upwards. And yeah, people really felt that we were perhaps trying to make some kind of political point here and trying to suggest that in the UK, for example, things weren't as bad as they were. So the clear takeaway from that seems to be that quite apart from people reacting to the actual data and geometry in your charts, they're going to come in with all sorts of baggage, as it were, in terms of their understandings and feelings about the subject matter. And there may be decisions that you made in the construction of your charts that you felt were purely technical, purely to do with data viz, but people are actually going to read into that a lot more than what you intended. So generally there seem to be two camps of people roughly who would look at these charts. There are people who, like us in this session today, who would just look at these numbers and think, right, okay, yeah, what's going on there? And a very sort of analytical way of analysing the chart. But there was a huge number of others who, and I think this goes back to my first point really as well about the use of text and how people understand charts, they would just take away a single overarching message from these charts. And so they would look at something where the lines were sort of becoming a bit more gentle, and they would think, oh, this chart is trying to say things aren't actually that bad at all. And so it was just a really interesting demonstration of how you kind of need to cater to those needs. You don't want someone to have a negative reaction to your chart based on some design choice that you made, even if you hadn't realised what impact it was going to have. So yeah, this can lead people to completely sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater. They'll decide that this chart is wrong, it's worthless, it's junk, because it has this, it jars with their understanding of the subject matter. So this is the next lesson for us, which was that information visualization, data viz, is about much more than just pixels on a page and geometry and shape and space and color. It's about the whole feeling that something creates and whether that meshes with or jars with someone's perceptions of the topic at hand. So we need to think about that when we're producing a chart, especially on a divisive or sort of sensitive topic like this, and minimise the risk that someone's going to react badly because of some choices that we've consciously made with geometry. If someone's objecting to the data itself, that's their problem. If someone was looking at this chart and saying, oh, why are you showing COVID cases going up when the pandemic is over? Well, that would be flat out wrong because COVID cases were going up. But if someone's objecting to the use of a different scale, for example, and the tone, the feel that gives to your chart, I think that's not unreasonable. Their feelings are what their feelings are, and it's important for us to consider that when we're designing our charts. So what we did in the end at the FT was we turned these static graphics that we've been producing every day with a log scale into an interactive piece where you can choose between log or linear. So anyone then complaining about not understanding or being misled by the use of a log scale, for example, could then flit between the two, toggle between the two on our page here. And that's what many, many, many people have done over the course of the last year. The next point, and this comes back to what I was saying earlier about the value of something like social media or whatever platform you're publishing your charts on. And I want to talk about how you can gain an enormous amount from thinking about data viz again as a fundamental act of communication, as a dialogue. So instead of just throwing your chart out there and walking away, sort of explosions in the background as it were, stick around, get into the conversation and see what you can learn and what you can gain from those conversations about the work that you've done. I feel so fortunate, as it were, to have had the number of interactions I've had with people all over the world from all walks of life, all levels of data and visual literacy about the charts that I've built, because I have now an enormous amount of information on what people have liked, what people haven't liked, what people have struggled with, what people have been challenged by but risen to, what people have just sort of thrown their hands up at and not liked at all. And so getting into those conversations, I think it's absolutely critical, whether you're publishing this as a journalist to a mass audience, whether it's to colleagues at your workplace, wherever it is. So to do that, one thing we did very explicitly from quite early on in our sort of visual coverage of the pandemic was we explicitly solicited this kind of feedback. Because sure, as I've shown you with some of those responses to the log scales, the nature of Twitter is that you will get feedback whether you ask for it or not. But I think, as anyone who's thought about this for any amount of time knows, the quality of feedback you'll get goes up through the roof, or exponentially one might say, when you actually ask for that. Because first of all, there are a hell of a lot of people, the majority of people, in fact, aren't just going to randomly hit a stranger with a load of thoughts on the work that they've just done. A lot of people are polite, or they're shy, or this is just not how they work online. Whereas when you actively go out there and say, let us know what you think about the stuff that we've been doing here. What do you think of these charts? Did they work? Did they not? Any other thoughts you have? First of all, you're opening the door. You're telling these people who are maybe more introverted or just don't see it as their place to comment. You're telling them that, yeah, we want to hear your thoughts. But you're also, I think, making that any criticism you receive much more likely to be constructive, because people now know that their criticism is going to be acted upon and they're not just sort of shouting into the screen. So we would explicitly ask for feedback over email, over Twitter direct messages in the replies. We actually ended up setting up a completely separate inbox just for people to talk to us about these charts. And this is just a snapshot from one day in April. And this was a full screen of Gmail, but this one day's messages spanned more than one full screen. So we had about 100 messages in one day about this chart. And I don't think people will be able to read the text there, but if I just talk through the range of stuff we were getting here, we've got people pointing us to data sources that we didn't know about before for countries in the world that we didn't previously include in our charts. We've got people pointing out things that they struggled with and would like us to change in our charts. We've got people just thanking us for doing these charts. We've got people who maybe a bit less politely are just saying, I didn't like this. We've got people asking us to include different charts. We've got people coming to us with story ideas, an enormous range of information that both in terms of how we iterate on this data viz and how we just cover the pandemic more broadly were incredibly, incredibly valuable. And none of this information would have come to us if we hadn't set up this inbox, if we hadn't asked people to send this to us. So the lesson there, I think, is very clear, which is that if we want to, do the best that we can do as data visualization practitioners, both in terms of improving the work that we do through feedback, and in terms of just effectively reaching as many people as possible and making them feel like charts and data viz are for them and not just for data nerds, continued communication is absolutely critical. So I might suggest, for example, that you might want to put a contact email or Twitter handle or whatever works best for you on your charts sometimes, so that wherever someone encounters this piece of work in the wild, they'll know they can come to you and they can give you thoughts. I just feel like it's so invaluable, and you will learn so much about what does and doesn't work and the shades of grey in between by doing this. Whereas I think there's often a tendency for us in data viz to see our job as just making a thing, and then we put the thing out there and we forget about it. But really, really, if there's one thing I can get to you from today, it's don't do that. Stick around. Enjoy the chat. The next point, big learning curve for me, and again, that audience feedback was absolutely critical to this, was the risk of trying to be too clever, trying to be too technical with solutions to data viz problems, and essentially losing people along the way and losing trust along the way. So the term blinding with science, I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but for those who aren't, it's the idea that you're telling someone about something in an overly complex or technical way, so that regardless of the result of what you've done, they end up going away scratching their head. They're not quite sure, because of the terminology, because of the methodology, they're not quite sure what you've done. And I think there's often a risk with that in data viz. So the question that we had, this was still back in the spring, was could we improve the way we drew the lines on our charts so that instead of using a simple 7-day rolling average as we had been doing, we got slightly smoother lines, but we also got lines where the final data point on the chart was a more faithful reflection of the final data point in real life. Because of course the problem when you're doing a 7-day average, whether you align that 7-day average to the right, to the middle, to the left, is it's never going to be a especially close representation of the last data point you have, because it's being influenced by the other 6. And so the issue we were having is the numbers in our headlines, in our news stories at the FT, would always be referring to that last data point, the thing that has just happened. But our charts were referring to the 7-day average, which was, while cases were going up, always lower than that. And so we would have this tension where the numbers on our charts didn't quite reflect the numbers in the news. So what we decided to do was look at whether we could optimize the way we actually draw the lines on the chart so that they're still smooth, as you get with an average, but they also actually more faithfully reflect the very latest data point you have. So for those of you who have only ever seen 7-day average charts of COVID data, this is what the underlying data actually looks like. It's incredibly noisy. You get these huge peaks and troughs. New daily cases will drop to 0 and then shoot up to 1,000 the next day, because the way that this data is actually collected and reported leads to enormous differences in the numbers you get from day to day. There's weekly cyclicality, there's all sorts of stuff going on. So we definitely didn't want the data to look like this. Now, of course, the last point of each line here would reflect reality, would reflect the last data point we had, but it's far too noisy, we couldn't publish that. So here's the rolling average method we had been using. Much clearer, much smoother. You can see exactly what's going on. You get clear trends over time. You can see here, for example, that Italy had reached its peak and started coming back down. But the last data point on each of these lines didn't necessarily match up with the last data point that had been recorded. So what we considered was a smoothing spline. So it keeps that smoothness of the lines. It's still relatively easy to discern what's going on in one country and compare it to another. But the last data point is now, because of how the splines are calculated, much closer to the last data point that had been recorded. And you can see that in this next chart. So we actually measured how close to the final reported data point was the last data point of each line when we use this method. On the left-hand side, you've got a simple rolling average. On the right-hand side, you've got the spline. And you can see that the data points were much closer to the real reported value on the right. So we decided, let's switch over to the spline. And we did, again, a long explainer of why we'd done this, setting out that need to better represent the most recent data while keeping smoothness, big explanation out in the public for anyone to see. And I then, again, following my own advice, asked people what did they think. And here's the kind of responses we got. And what you'll notice is there were sort of two quite clearly different camps here. On the left, top left, we've got a couple of people saying spline's much better. Yeah, I'm very devoted to splining myself, for example. And the thing I should point out immediately about that is that these two people, Peter and Micah, and I don't know if either of them are actually watching along today, are both data scientists to some degree. So, you know, I think anyone who's heard of splines felt very positive about that as an idea. But then we get some different feedback. In the upper right, we've got someone saying the rolling average is much easier for the average person to understand. And in the lower left, we've got someone with a data science background, but still saying that the rolling average probably makes more sense. And then in the lower left, we actually have one of the epidemiologists in the UK working on the development of the vaccines, talking about how this is for the general public. The audience for this work is a mass audience. It's an audience with a very mixed visual and data literacy, and it's much easier for people to get their head around a 7-day average than a spline. So different people, with different personal contexts, had very different views on this. So the takeaway that we had again from this was that you have to prioritise the ease of understanding. You may have come up with an incredibly technical, nifty solution that on the basis of any sort of quantitative tests works better, but if that is going to confuse people along the way, that is a problem. And again, for me, the fundamental goal of my data visualizations is communication with a mass audience. And I would rather have clear communication and as many people as possible understanding, remembering and wanting to share these charts than to have something which is 5% more correct, shall we say, but that loses a lot of people along the way. The final lesson that we've learned, and just in the last couple of weeks, I think, in our work on the pandemic, has been the importance and just the way that you can use animation to tell a story much, much more effectively than telling that same story in a static chart. And So I've done a couple of bits of animation over the last couple of years, which have been especially effective. And I think the lesson I've really learned from this is that it's the sense of tension and of anticipation that you can build up when you do animation well, can produce a much stronger response from people, a much stronger reaction than doing exactly the same chart as a static chart. So I'm going to show you two examples of that, and they're examples that some of you may have seen in recent days, which are where I wanted to make the point that COVID really is considerably worse, for example, than a bad flu. So here's the first chart, and what we're looking at here, this is a GIF, it's an animation, it's going to loop, so if you miss it the first time, we'll see it the second time. We're looking at the weekly rate of people admitted into ICU, so intensive care units, in England, with flu in a typical winter over the last few years, and then contrasting that with what we've seen this year for COVID. And you'll see quite clearly that flu admissions in the past were, even when we thought they were high, so even when we had what at the time were seen as record bad flu winters, those figures were much lower than what we've seen over the last month or two in England with COVID. So this was really an attempt to put to bed this myth, this idea that, oh, COVID's just, it's just flu rebranded, it's just a new version of what we'd seen before, and show that this really is a completely different beast. Now, some people would come back to this and say, well, we're just testing a lot more for COVID this year, so that's why we see much higher numbers than we usually would with flu. But again, I had another animated response to that, which is to show the total numbers of people in ICU, in intensive care, in London, UK, for any reason, and compare that again from winter to winter. So in a typical year, even during a bad flu season, the numbers of people in intensive care in London never go above about 750. So again, this is whether they're in there for flu, whether they're in there for a heart attack, for a stroke, any of that. But the numbers of people in there for all causes never really go above about 750 and are typically around 700. Whereas this year, they've gone up above 1,200. And in fact, in recent days have gone closer to 1,400. So almost double the number of people in intensive care in London this year than a usual year. And unless there's been a sudden surge in the numbers of people falling down multiple flights of stairs, we can point to the one thing that is different about this year, which is COVID. But the point is, for what I consider to be a really important topic here, which is correcting relatively widely held myths that what we were seeing this winter was nothing out of the ordinary, and therefore we don't need to be in lockdown, we don't need any restrictions because this is just like any other winter. You gain an enormous amount by producing this as an animation. It's a much more engaging piece of work, and this graphic on Twitter alone has now been seen by more than 10 million people, which is far more people who've seen this graphic than any other chart that we produce at the FT all year on social media. And that, I think, and in fact it's not just what I think, a lot of the responses on social media have explicitly pointed to this. The use of animation was pivotal to that in terms of how it grabs attention more than a static chart, in terms of how it builds suspense, and in terms of how you get that shock, that surprise factor at the end when you compare the two. So the key point there being, where it's suitable, animation is an incredibly powerful technique to use to convey a message. Now, I think it should be used sparingly. If you suddenly make everything animated, it's like the old days of 90s internet where you've got pop-ups everywhere. Everything's too noisy, it's hard to actually get across your key point and everything gets drowned out. But using animation sparingly, I think, is an incredibly powerful technique. So all of that is to say that the last 12 months, I think, have been an incredible crash course for me and for our team at the FT in terms of really getting to the fundamentals of how people do read charts, and therefore what we should be thinking about when we make charts, what we should be focusing on and prioritising. And coming into this year, I think my assumption, and a lot of people here, I'm sure, the assumption would have been that people read charts a bit like this. They get out their protractor, their set square, their ruler, and their compass, and it's all about precision, and people are really focusing on individual pixels and where different elements are in your plot when they're trying to take away their message. They're almost trying to parse the data set back out of your chart, and so you as the practitioner should really be focusing on the most high fidelity, most clear encoding of that data as possible. But the reality, I think, is actually a bit more like this. It's a bit more like people going to a movie theatre and sitting back and watching. They are coming to a chart to see something, to see some kind of story, to get a message, to take away something that is playing out in front of them. You know, in some cases literally with the animation, but in other cases it's just a line chart. But it's a line chart where they're not focusing on, you know, tiny differences between data points on the chart. They're focusing on what is this top line message in the title, what's the takeaway here, and what are the other sort of sweeping trends that this chart is conveying. They're not poring over it, trying to extract the values from every pixel on the page. So to summarise, the key lessons I think I've learned here, and I think these are lessons that I'm going to be using for the rest of my career. First of all, text is critical. I know we're all in the data viz industry, we make charts, but if we don't get the text right, none of the rest really matters. People will be lost, they'll be confused, it will all be a disaster. The second point, we have to take responsibility. If someone is confused about our chart, that's our fault. And the best thing we can do to combat that is to include explanations in situ around where that chart appears to make sure that there's as little risk as possible of confusion. On a similar note, we need to be considering what are people's beliefs, feelings, emotions, sentiments around this subject matter, and how could they colour their reaction to this chart? How can we design this chart in as neutral a way as possible in that sense, so that at least if anyone does have any issues with their chart, it's because they don't like the data. It's not because they feel put off or hurt somehow by the way we've actually conveyed the information. The next step, and I think again one of the most important, don't just publish and vanish. Stick around, get involved in the conversation. You will learn so much about how people are understanding your chart that you can incorporate into the next one you make. And make sure that your chart, above all else, is easy to understand. It doesn't matter if you can fine-tune it to make it 2, 3, 4% more faithful to the data. It doesn't even matter, I think, as much as we think it does, about optimizing tiny little things about how people understand uncertainty or ranges or confidence intervals, for example. The key thing is that you focus on getting across that core message and getting it across accessibly. And finally, we should all be aware that we have this incredibly powerful tool in animation, and there are plenty of charts where we would unthinkingly just produce a static chart, but an animation can have that much more, I would say in fact orders of magnitude more impact. And I'm going to end with a call to action in terms of things that I would like us as the data viz community to do differently or do more or even do for the first time as we go away from this, which is that first of all, as I mentioned at the very start, there's a huge amount of resources out there on how to achieve particular technical or visual effects in a chart, but there's not very much on the general way of framing your work and the language you use around it in order to achieve the clearest possible communication of a message. So what I'd love to see and what I hope to participate in myself is putting out more resources that can help people think of and refine this idea of data viz as communication more than data viz just as a technical exercise of creating the most objectively good chart possible. And secondly, I'd like us to be more to think about accessibility in the broadest of senses when we make our charts. Because we love making charts and because we know other people, most people on this call I'm sure, on this session, love looking at charts, it can be very easy to get into the trap of thinking, oh, what's the coolest thing I can do here that other chart people will love? How can I push the envelope? How can I make this chart especially exciting and impressive to people who like charts? But that is the tiniest tip of the iceberg, and the rest of this enormous thing beneath the surface of the sea is non-chart people. It's people who last looked at charts when they were aged 16, 17, 18 and then got the hell away from them. They're probably people who try to even avoid spreadsheets. But that is an enormous audience of people who could love charts if they just had charts that spoke to them and charts that didn't try to be too smart, charts that didn't condescend to them. So the other thing I'd love us all to do is think more about making charts, not that are graphics for graphics editors, as someone once said to me, but charts that are for your mum, your dad, and everyone else out there in the world. So thank you very much for bearing with me through all of this, and please do fire me all your questions. And I'd also encourage you, in the spirit of what I've been saying here, do send me a tweet or an email or anything like that with other questions you have if we don't get time for them just now, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this stuff.